As we move into this next section, got a couple of experiences to share with you about the big three. And the big three again are truthful, accurate information, some sort of empathic response, and some sort of follow-up. And so Marty Hatley, who will come up here in a little bit and tell his experience, had a positive experience, and I had an absolutely horrible one. I want to share with you that relates to doing workshops. So when I was working with the Beta Healthcare Group, as you guys know, the largest med-mal insurance carrier in the state of California, they're rolling out their Candor equivalent, which I think I mentioned is called HEART, where H stands for healing, the E is empathy, the A is accountability, the R stands for resolution, and the T for trust. So we did this really cool workshop, 2-day workshop. When we're done, we go out, we celebrate a little bit. I'm Irish, I think we talked about that before. So I go to bed around 1 o'clock in the morning, but it sometimes, and this happened to me last night, I need a little white noise to help me go to sleep, especially when I'm not in my normal bed at home doing that. So I'll put white noise on. My favorite white noise is actually rain and thunder. I love to listen to that. It really helps me fall asleep. So I'm in one of the fanciest hotels in Northern California, and I lie down in bed, and I put this app on, and then I drift off to sleep. And then an hour or so later, it becomes ridiculously real. I literally, in my sleep, start feeling like I'm being rained upon. I'm serious. I mean, it is, and then I'm just lying there and I'm like, wow, this is a lot of rain. And then finally I wake up and I have the presence of mind to videotape what was happening to me, ironically, when my app was still going. So if you want to play this video and listen carefully. This is my hotel room. And that thing started to spark, the light thing that's there. And the one on the right is going right into my luggage. Honest to God, this is literally 2 o'clock in the morning in one of the finest hotels. And so I was pouty when this happened. I mean, I'm serious, because I'm due to get up early in the morning, all that stuff, and my luggage is now totally filled with water. And so I pick up the phone, I call the front desk immediately, they send people up, they help move me out of that room into a different room so I can dry off and figure out what I'm gonna do. I go to the front desk, they're not particularly apologetic, and I explain to them all what happened, and what should I have gotten? Truthful and accurate information, some empathic response, and a little follow-up, and maybe an offer of some sort of thing to dry clean my clothes. Here's what I get, and here's the letter, which I can read to you for those in the back. So this comes from the Claremont Club and Spa, Fairmont Hotel, again, 5-star, one of the top hotels in all of Northern California. I understand you recently stayed with us for the Beta Heart workshop and unfortunately had a bit of a rude awakening during the middle of the night. I hope that the unfortunate emergency did not take away from your overall enjoyment of our hotel and the success of the meeting. I'd be happy to talk to you. So I'm reading this and I'm not seeing any of the big three. Nobody's explaining what happened. There's no empathic response. I was sad. It just was wrong. So how do you think I feel about the Fairmont? Not very positive, right? Not a lot of love, not a lot of trust. But on the other hand, things can go well. Marty, I'm gonna have Marty Hatley come up. Many of you asked the last time about patient-family engagement. How do you identify patients who can be part of your committees and all that sort of stuff? Marty is the national, international expert in actually doing that. Works with me at MedStar, brought him here for the day. He'll be commenting on it. But as he will get into that a little bit later, he's gonna tell his story about Lufthansa. Right. In your experience.
So Tim and I actually spent a lot of time together, especially with weather delays. We had a 10-hour drive once to a Candor workshop, so we tell each other stories, and he told me this one just yesterday. So I said, well, I've got the opposite experience. I was in Geneva, Switzerland, coming back to Chicago, had to connect through Munich. My flight was delayed, of course. It's my curse. It was also my birthday. There was a birthday party waiting for me in Chicago where I landed. So I'm on this flight to Munich. There's a pilot sitting next to me who's going to be a pilot for another flight. So we're all delayed. We're all anxious. Are we going to miss our connections? We land in Munich. These buses come up, and one says New York, one says LA, one says DC. No Chicago bus there waiting for me. And the pilot jumps up and he opens the overhead because he's late, and a suitcase falls out, and it hit me right in the bridge of my glasses, broke my glasses, and cut me, but a minor cut, but the blood was everywhere. And I couldn't see it, but I could tell from the reactions that everyone thought I was really, really badly injured. So I missed my trip to my flight to Chicago. I had to get this treated, and Lufthansa was so fantastic. It was like, here's a nice hotel room, here's an open bar, here's a restaurant, we feel terrible about your birthday. So they basically did Candor. They gave me the empathy, and then it was, how do I process a claim for my broken glasses? Just send us the bill. And there was no paperwork. I just sent them a bill. There was no restrictions. There was no management letter like that. It was just a complete solution. So I'm here to tell you, fly Lufthansa, they do Candor.
Thank you, Marty.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And you'll hear from Marty later on, but it really is, doing the right thing right away when this stuff happens. Own it early on, which is what Jen is going to get to. So I'm going to tee your slides up here. Here we go. So Jen Gonzalez, she works with MedStar. She works a lot with Larry Smith. Knows the Gentries really, really well. And she's now going to take us through some of the other topics that we have on the agenda, like how do we decide whether our care is appropriate or not? If it is inappropriate, how do we calculate what the damages might be? All those kind of things we're going to go through, and how you set it up and how you have those empathic conversations. So Jen, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you.
There's the clicker, and I'll let you describe a little bit more about your background, because I think they'll be happy to hear your nursing background and the other stuff you've done.
Sure.
So.
Well, first of all, I really want to thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you about our process, give you some insight into how we work and how we deal with all these situations, each one of them being very unique. So that's one of the key things you have to keep in mind. But as Tim said, I work for MedStar Health. I work in the corporate risk management office. I work directly for Larry Smith, who's been mentioned here a couple of times. And Jack, I will not tell him what you said earlier in the day. And I do want to thank the Gentries as well. I mean, I have had the opportunity to hear them speak on multiple occasions, and every time I hear it, it's just so inspirational, and we really thank you for your participation with us. So I am a nurse 100 years ago. I did ER nursing, and I got involved in a lot of quality assurance practices, and eventually it drove me to going to law school, which if you had asked me growing up, would you ever go to law school? The answer would have been emphatically no. But it's been a really incredible combination of education and experience. I've worked in medical malpractice defense. I worked for a law firm that currently defends MedStar. I worked with them for a number of years, and then the nurse in me got so frustrated looking at events, 3 years, 5 years, whatever it was, and thinking, oh my gosh, what happened after this? What happened at the hospital after this? Why do we wait so long for these things to come to fruition, and what can we do to improve the delivery of our care? And so I made the decision to leave litigation and go to risk management. And having defended MedStar, I went to MedStar when I made this decision and asked if there was a way I could get involved with their risk management program. So I started off at the hospital center, which is a very large hospital. I did risk management there, and then I moved to director of risk management for MedStar Georgetown Hospital. And from there, I ended up in claims with Larry Smith. So I joke around that I don't know where my next place is because they keep moving me around. So we'll have to see what happens. But I love my job, I will say, from the very beginning. It's challenging. It can be emotional at times with patients and their families. but I work with an incredibly gifted and supportive group of individuals from the very top of MedStar through more entry-level positions even within the hospitals and offices. So it's a team effort in every regard, and that's what I think makes it successful. So I'm going to move on, and then obviously it's interactive, and please feel free to ask questions. I'm happy to answer them. So this is just my lame attempt at comedy, but you should have seen the look on our faces when we realized that we'd been looking at the x-rays backwards for the first hour of surgery. Which I won't say it's happened, but all right. The key takeaway from what I have to say today is manage the event from the very beginning. If you do not take the opportunity to engage with patients and or their families at the time of an unanticipated event, regardless of the severity, you lose that opportunity forever. And if you lose that opportunity, then the rest of Candor is very difficult to catch up and be effective. So timing is everything. Sometimes it's just a quick, I'm here, I'm a point person for you. The family usually is in shock, depending again on the severity of the event. I can't even imagine what is going through people's minds when they are personally affected by these events. I'm sure it's just, their mind's probably going a million miles an hour. I think the main message that we try at our local entities to give these families is that we are aware. It's been brought to our attention. This was not what we anticipated would happen during your stay here. I'm here to simply reassure you at this moment in time that we take it very seriously. We are going to review the care, and we are going to provide follow-up for you. We don't know many, many times all the nuances of an event in real time. So again, it's really just reassuring the family that we are aware this happened. It's not what we expected to happen, and we are going to do everything we can to help answer questions. So we do rely on our local, we call it the GO team. We have patient advocacy, there's quality and safety, who are within the hospital, who are notified. Our associate medical directors are often notified immediately. The vice president of medical affairs, again, depending on the severity of the situation, he or she is notified immediately. And so we go ahead and try to activate things as quickly as possible so the event review process can start. There's nothing worse than having an event happen on day X, and this event review takes place 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later. We have the patient communication service, which is a multidisciplinary group of physicians that have generously volunteered to help us with the disclosure process. As has been reiterated before, some of our providers are better at disclosure than others. And so we have this network of multidisciplinary providers to assist in helping the provider prepare for these meetings when they happen, or be there to help answer questions with the family, but have the other provider, the volunteer provider, be the main voice during some of these meetings. I have to say, in my experience, typically the providers that are directly involved in the event usually will want to be an active part of the disclosure process. Now, I know we're going to get into this a little bit later. Many of MedStar's physicians are insured through the system, which is a huge advantage. And I'll get into the challenges of independent providers a little later. The other thing that's not on this slide, and I'm not going to belabor it, but we also have a strong care for the caregiver program so that those providers that are involved with these events get the support and resources they need to help deal with the event. None of our providers come in to work that day intending to cause harm, and so we want to make sure they get the support that they need. So service recovery. This, again, the timing can be important with patients and families. I would say that from my many meetings with families, the best thing I can do many times is to sit and listen. It's an opportunity for them to voice their fears, their immediate concerns, and it's an opportunity for me as a member of MedStar to see what they need now. What in real time can I do for them to help alleviate this stress? I don't even know the outcome of any event review, but some events are, as we know, unfortunately, can be catastrophic, and I don't need to wait for the results of an event review, excuse me, before I try and see what can I do for this family. So these things can vary in, in terms of the expense. I mean, it can be little things if it's a smaller event, just parking, getting them meals. And if you go to Georgetown, parking is a big deal. A big deal. It can be flying family members in from another part of the country. We had a gentleman who fell, had what appeared to be a life-threatening bleed, and his 2 daughters were in California. So we immediately called, flew them in, hotel, those kinds of things. It's the time to build the rapport with the family. As Teresa alluded to, you don't always have their trust at the beginning, but the more that you interact with them, the more that you can share with them that we're here to help you at this moment. What can we do? You start to build that trust. It can take time. People are very skeptical. I mean, we've helped with living expenses. Somebody who was hospitalized for a couple of months, we covered their rent and car payment. And they kept saying, well, I'm not signing anything. I'm not signing anything. I don't want to. We don't ask for patients to sign something at this stage of the game. So it's really just, again, the opportunity to build the trust and rapport with families. If you're not sure of your final position on the standard of care, which is often the case, and again, it depends on the situation, set parameters around what you can do for this family. We've provided home care for X amount of time, and we say to the family, we're going to provide home care for 30 days to help you at home, and then we don't say we're going to cut it off at 30 days. We simply say we're going to reevaluate it and see where we are. And that way we still can engage the family. We still have their input. They're a partner with us in trying to determine what they need. And I will say, I still haven't, and I'm not just saying this, I've found it rare that any family would take advantage of that situation. Their appreciation for us trying to intervene and help them during their time of need, it just goes a long way. Again, we want to intervene whether the event is big or small. If we know there are opportunities that we can identify that we missed, it may not have changed. We may find later on it wouldn't have changed the outcome. But if we can identify opportunities, again, this is our opportunity to build the rapport and trust with these families. I mean, these families look at, as they would probably any healthcare system, a big corporation, what are they doing? I don't get why they're doing this. So it's really the goodwill that even in the event, at the end of the day, we say, we really have exhaustively reviewed this event with your family member or yourself, and the care was appropriate. By the time you get there, but you've been helping and communicating and keeping the lines of communication open, while it doesn't always go over, well, family may not agree, and that happens. The level of anger is lessened because they know we have been trying in good faith to work with them from the beginning of the time of the event.
So, Jen, so a question for you on that.
Yep.
And some of the people in the audience may be wondering this. So MedStar's 10 hospitals, you have isn't that right, a bunch of clinics,
Yes.
all that stuff. You have the academic place at Georgetown, you have places in DC, up in Baltimore. You're at the high level, overseeing all of this. How does it come to the attention of those in the organization that here's a harm event that may be worthy of service recovery? And then when you get the event, could you just share a little bit about your thought processes of here's one where we are going to reach out, we are going to provide this, and here's one where we're not? Because it would seem to me with a system that big, there could be a lot of service recovery going out there. It could be very expensive, and particularly for smaller hospitals.
Sure.
How do you notify it? How do you triage it? How do you think about which are the ones where we're going to provide that?
So our claims department, or our corporate risk management office, we are basically tied to the hip with our local entities. Some are busier than others due to volume, but we have a ongoing, probably daily conversations with our local risk management offices across the system. Our risk managers and patient advocates, I will say, know that if they come across a family or a patient where there's been some kind of event, that they can escalate to our claims office immediately. They can call anytime. One of the advantages of MedStar is we are a self-insured entity. So we have the flexibility to act in real time. I don't have to go through a big formal committees and through all these, I don't have to jump a lot of hoops to get what I need to fly 2 people in from California. We can just make that immediate decision at that time and make the arrangements. So that's a huge advantage for us. Again, it's really the rapport and working relationship that we have with our local entities to be notified in real time. And I will say, our risk managers do have some authority that in real time they can act. Now, this always gets tricky. You don't want to promise the world and then not be able to deliver on that. But at least, a hotel room, whatever it might be, they have the discretion to do that, and they know that they have our support, and then ultimately, then we would take care of that. So we try to keep it open. We always encourage reporting and putting events into not only for incident reports, but we also have a data bank or data system, I shouldn't use that word, a system where they can enter potentially compensable events into this electronic, but then come to us if it's our hospital. So like I cover 5 hospitals. Any event that goes on in that hospital is put into this database so that I can see it. And then if I see something, I can be like, call them up and say, oh my gosh, who's working with this family? Has somebody reached out to them? So we do try and keep it. Now, we can't do everything for everyone, obviously, because you're right, it does get expensive. But I will say that at an initial blush, we really, as we've been using the term leap of faith, we try to identify those where we recognize that there could be some bigger needs that are immediate and what we can do to intervene and help.
I see. So, because like in Jack and Teresa's case, I think it was pretty clear in the operating room, an accident had happened. Right. So they're communicating that to you. So you've got a pretty good idea, even though you haven't done your full review, that it's appropriate to move in this pathway.
Correct.
So is it safe to say it's those cases where you have a gut feeling that care did not live up to the MedStar standards, even though you haven't done the full review, is one that you'll start to lean in and think about the recovery piece?
Yes.
Okay.
Most definitely.
Okay.
Most definitely.
I'm curious, what kind of service recovery do other hospitals who are here have? Any authority to provide some financial stuff for patients and families when stuff happens? I'm just curious from the others who are here. I love this part of the workshop. Yes.
We don't have that in place at this time to that level. We have a toolkit that we do basic service recovery, but not to that extent. And we were just talking about that we probably need to develop a process for that.
Okay. Others have anything in place where they're able to offer? Because over there you go. Yeah, Marty's going to throw it.
Okay, toss.
Yeah, we have a process in place where it's pretty open. And along the same lines, if it's something that we had a part in, whether somebody slips on ice in the parking lot that we didn't get salted, or if something happens during a procedure, we pursue what to make it right with the patient. And obviously we get our insurance carrier involved. We're not self-insured. But it's just a decision that's made in administration within a team that's identified to follow up with that patient.
Yeah. Thank you.
Who's your insurance carrier?
MMIC.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome.
they've been great to work with. They give advice. They're
Yeah.
fully supportive of service recovery to help prevent claims, obviously. But even we've had cases that we provided a good bit of service recovery and it still went to petition. So
That's what I was going to say. I mean,
Yes.
sometimes I get comments like, I don't know, it's rare, but why are we doing all this? Because in the end, you know they're going to sue us anyway. So the answer really comes from the top of MedStar, and that is, we're not doing this to avoid a lawsuit. That's not the goal of our actions. The goal of our actions is to help this family in real time.
and it's to make it right for the
and
patient.
make it right. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
You got it.
So I'd like to, Ed, if you could speak a little bit to what COPIC's approach is. I learned a ton from them over the last few years about the 3 R's program, about reaching out to patients and families after it. But it is sort of a service recovery approach in a way. Could you share that and kind of what the limits are and what you're able to do? Because it's been very successful.
Sure, and Jean Martin also spoke a little bit earlier, so she can help fill in any gaps that I may leave. But COPIC Insurance has a program that, as Dr. McDonald said, is called the 3 R's program, which is recognize, resolve, and respond. So when there is that unexpected outcome, not the really big ones like a death or a wrong side operation, but for the smaller type things, maybe medication errors or whatever, we work with the physician or the provider and then the patient's family to try to bring some early resolution to the situation and make some upfront compensation or reimbursement, I guess we should call it, reimbursement for types of expenses the patient may incur. So if they have to go back and have a follow-up procedure and they incur some additional out-of-pocket expenses for co-pays or co-insurance deductibles, and we can go ahead and reimburse the patient for that. Or other types of miscellaneous expenses. I always like the example where, one person was apprehensive about trying to get some care, but nobody was there to watch their dog. So we provided a dog sitter for them, just those kind of things to make the patient feel like somebody's listening to them, somebody's trying to bring resolution to the situation, and we'll make them whole again, if at all possible. So it's been very successful for us. Dr. McCoy talked about people who go through the Candor. There's about 94%, I think he said, that actually don't end up in case. Our experience has been that 97% of the people who go through our 3 R's program do not end up bringing a lawsuit against people. So it's engaged them, it's engaged providers, it's engaged the patients, and hopefully provides them the answers that they want through that process, so they don't have to go through the legal process to kind of find those answers.
Yeah. And so as it works, and just because you totally love what you said, and to point out what you heard here is, when they give the compensation in the 3 R's, there's no release sign. They can sue later if they want to. It is just trying to make it right by them, even without doing a full review of whether we've met the standard of care or not. It's a classic service recovery, Jen, as you described as well.
And we'll go up to maybe $50,000. I think we've kind of upped that here recently, but can go up to $50,000 per case to help bring some resolution.
That's great. Anything else you want to add? to that? Again, you guys were forerunners in teaching communication, identifying good communicators. I mean,
Yeah, it's been, I think we've had 3 R's, and I'm glad you remember what it all stands for, because they put us on the spot. I'm like, oh, it's just 3 R's. But it's definitely different when the Iowa Candor law came along. I mean, we weren't involved at that time in legislative efforts, but we were like, well, how do we put that all together? Because it's really a different process, and there's not a privilege, you know, for the 3 R's the way there is with Candor. But we actually really were very thoughtful about it, and you know, have actually an endorsement in Iowa, and we define candor differently than a claim.
Sure.
But for other purposes, we treat it as a claim. And it's a bit more of a challenge for a commercial carrier like Copic working with candor, as opposed to a large hospital system where you're you know, dealing with just one entity, and we may be dealing with multiple.
great. Well, Jen's going to be getting into that. But thank you, Jen. I just thought I'd bring it up because
I appreciate
these
it.
examples of service recovery are really important to think about when bad stuff happens.
Yeah, and I'll just comment, I'm very impressed with your creativity with the example of the dog sitting, because it is amazing what sometimes a little thing that is so out of the box, but it can make a world of difference for patients and their families. So it's interesting. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about something that always can be a little muddled, and that's determining the appropriateness of care and causation. So, as I'm sure all you know, first, is there a duty between the healthcare provider or system to this patient? The one that gets sticky is breach. Was there a breach in the standard of care? That can be very tricky, and I'm going to go into a little bit more explanation on that. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, there are it's rare that you have an obvious breach of the standard of care. Most of the time, it's gray, and it takes time to figure out whether indeed there was a breach in the standard of care, and did that breach have a direct causation or an injury for this patient. So I know most of you know this. What is the standard of care? So really, in a med-mal case, the typical definition is the type and level of care an ordinary, prudent healthcare professional with the same training and experience would provide under similar circumstances in the same community. So that can vary tremendously. It can be an elusive term, there can be many nuances, it can be very difficult to define, and that is what complicates things sometimes when we look at some of these cases. So how do we in MedStar determine the appropriateness of the level of care? Well, first we look to our local entities to perform self-assessments, to take a look at the care that was provided. We are in the process, and we've developed this system-wide practice council, which is comprised of multiple specialties. We have chairs of these practice council that are a resource for people like myself to look at these cases in their own specialty, not from their own hospital. So we try and keep it within MedStar, but out of the entity where the care took place. That helps us. We also, on occasion, will go ahead and assign defense counsel for the purposes of obtaining an external review, meaning going outside of MedStar. We don't do this with every patient event that occurs. This is, I'd say we do it maybe 10% of the time, and it typically is for those cases that involve a very highly specialized area of medicine that maybe our other MedStar hospitals don't really have a person or provider in place that can really review the nuances of the care. And the best example I can give to that, having been at Georgetown, is the Transplant Institute. They are our primary transplant hospital in the system, and so when and if there's an event involving their specialty, we typically will send that out because we feel that that's the best way to get an objective review. And then we have what Larry affectionately calls the MedStar standard of care versus the legal standard of care. So when we go through these reviews, and not only from external reviews, but our local reviews, we do the best we can to really take a look at that review, dig deep, and say, what really was our responsibility to this family? What were there opportunities that, although the legal standard of care might have been met, where do we fall within MedStar in terms of, did we really provide the standard of care to this patient? And Tim, you want me to?
So we're going to now get into kind of a case that's happened, and we want you to think about how would you and your organizations determine whether care was appropriate or not. And so this is a case where a 13-kilo child comes into the pediatrician, sore throat, gets a rapid strep test, child develops a rash on day 2, and then develops full-blown Stevens-Johnson syndrome. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with that, but basically it's like a massive burn over the entire body, and you are at risk of infection and sepsis and things like that. And unfortunately for this child dies from complications related to Stevens-Johnson syndrome. So a horrible, horrible, terrible, unexpected outcome. What are some of the questions that as you see this, because now you've got big, serious conversations to have, right? You need to think about kind of what's the immediate response. You need to be empathic with the family. You probably would let claims know, hey, we've had this unexpected death of a 3-year-old. But what are the kinds of things that areas where standard of care may be at issue here in this kind of case? What would some of those be? What would some questions automatically come to mind with what you see that's up there? Because this often is the report you're going to get. You know, here's what happened. Kid got amoxicillin, came into our hospital, sadly, horribly, terribly, ultimately passed away. What are some of the things you'd like to know?
I can't tell from this, but at what point was the child hospitalized? It wasn't hospitalized.
Right, yeah, so the child was hospitalized with that aggressive care. It happened on day 2. So that's a really good question. So the first question you'd want to know is, once the rash started, was the response to it appropriate and timely, and did they move in the right direction? And in this case, I can say yes, they did. They saw it right away, they were concerned about it, the patient gets admitted, and unfortunately still passes away. So that's the immediate response. What's some other things that might be worth getting a sense of? Was the standard of care met in this kind of case?
I asked myself right away, did the child have any known drug allergies prior to getting that prescription?
Right, so was there anything in the medical record that indicated amoxicillin was not the right medication for this child? Really great question. And in this case, had never had it before, and had never had penicillin type medication before. So this is one of those, tragic situations. It's the first time that the child's been exposed to amoxicillin. What other really, really great thoughts? Other thoughts that folks might have?
Was the dose appropriate for a 15 or a 13 kilogram child?
No. So the dose was twice as much accidentally from what the child otherwise should have gotten. So an important feature when you go back and you look at that. However, and so think about this, because this is why, remember, Jen's slide, duty, breach, and then causation and injury. With Stevens-Johnson, it will happen independent of the dose. So everybody who would look at this to say, yep, that was a mistake. Yeah. But it was not the cause of what happened. It was just the presence of amoxicillin. So think about this when it comes up to the enactment that we're going to do after lunch, which is you're going to need to have this conversation, this candor conversation with the family, but you're going to need to explain to them how horrible it was, mistakes were made, but it wouldn't have impacted on the outcome. So really, really good question. That comes up a lot, Jen, as you probably know.
Yes, it
You
does.
look at the care, bunch of mistakes happen, and there's not that linkage, the causation part. Yeah.
Was the rapid stress or strep test validated?
So it was, and it turned out there really was strep. And again, a really good question, which is, was it right to give him amoxicillin in the first place? Okay, all the way back to that. Because think about all the potential
Right.
causes of action, as we say, which is, wasn't the appropriate diagnosis, was the wrong medication, all these other reasons. You're thinking the way we would want you to think about this, which is, it was the appropriate medication for the appropriate diagnosis. And the strep was validated for that. Over there. Or any other?
I don't know anything about the syndrome. Does it typically lead to death, or is that an unusual course for it to take? Like, was the Stevens-Johnson syndrome addressed appropriately, or is it like a X% survival rate once you have it?
Most people do survive it. In this case, though, when the team looked back, and like the last workshop we did, when they looked at it, again, the care wasn't perfect, but all the appropriate things were given with regard to steroids and ventilation and when appropriate, the right antibiotics and all that. But so most people survive, but despite the best care, you can still have this horrible outcome. So again, really, really good question. Yeah.
Should the child have been hospitalized at the beginning?
So when people looked at that, they said, well, for strep throat in a 13-kilo child, no need to hospitalize. Almost always treated as an outpatient. So even got outside reviews to say, hey, at the time, from everything we have, the CBC, all that stuff, should there have been any reason to admit to the hospital? The answer was no.
I'm questioning the difficulty swallowing.
What's that?
I'm questioning the difficulty
Yeah, and so he did have, like a child with strep, but he was still able to stay well hydrated. And when he got into the hospital, he was well hydrated. Okay. But that's again, a really good question.
That's a good question.
Any other, yeah, over here.
Thorough review of his past medical history?
Yeah, so nothing in the past medical history that would tip you off to do this. There's no family history of horrible reactions to antibiotics, particularly the penicillin type ones, at least to any extent that we could see. Any other? So in the context of that, Jen, I got to now come back to you. You've asked all the questions, these great questions these guys did, and you've heard the answers. Would you provide service recovery for this family?
I would tell you that yes. I think MedStar would provide some service recovery to this family, and I hate using the word some, but I think if there was something that we could do, one of the things that we do often, I'll go into more detail, is when there's an event like this, risk at the local entity can put all the bills on hold while the care is being reviewed. So I would tell you, just based on what I'm looking at right now, MedStar, if there were opportunities that were missed, MedStar would probably waive out-of-pocket expenses so that this family, after losing their child, would then not be bombarded with bills from that hospitalization.
Yeah, but as you know, when you see this, all you have is that overdose of amoxicillin, and there's nothing else to indicate. This is why I've set it up, this, because I didn't want to make it easy, for you to answer this, because all the audience, you can see they're all looking and go, okay, this is a tough one.
It is a tough one, and I think, one, we would be notified, hopefully, in real time of this event. I would like to think that someone would have introduced themselves to the parents of this child, if that was feasible, depending on the timing. I know when somebody dies, unfortunately, sometimes you don't have that window. But I do think if we found things that could have been better, and in recognition of the grief of this family, that we probably would not offer direct compensation because the care was appropriate, but I think we would, as I said, waive the out-of-pocket so they didn't deal with
Well, and maybe some of the reimbursement part. That's why I would wonder on the COPIC side, would this be the kind of situation, without going into a full review, where you might, although you say it's a death case and it's worth a lot more than that, would this be one you would avoid through the 3 R's just because of the catastrophic outcome? Or how might you guys think about this case as you guys look at each other? I love asking tough questions.
That's the part that I don't get involved with. So.
What's that?
They exclude death because the goal of 3 R's is to maintain the physician-patient relationship, so it's one of the exclusions.
Okay.
Would it be candor? Yeah, I don't see any reason it wouldn't be something where you'd have a candor discussion.
A candor conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and get ready for that, because that is, like I said, after lunch. And you can imagine what those actors are going to be like as the parents of the 3-year-old. Only it won't be Mike McCoy up there. Later it'll be some of you guys who will go up and do that. So good. So let's go to the next. See, we've got go to the next slide, and then the one after that.
We are good.
Yep. So now let's talk about the case of the air embolism. We already gave you the facts earlier today, and many of you who are at the event review, what are some of the, who are some of the tortfeasors, shall we say, in the air embolism case? People who contributed to the death. You know, we've got the consent now, or we're in the process of getting consent. Who were some of the contributors to the death in that air embolism case? So the young physician who pulled the line out clearly is somebody, and you saw the interview at the last time as well. This is the person who, after the patient bleeds, after pulls the line out, lets the hand up for 10 seconds, and during that time the air gets sucked in. So certainly you have the physician in this case, since it's what you would most be exposed to these hospitals, it's a young physician, and let's say, for purposes of this conversation, it's an independent physician, Jen, because that's going to set you up with, that's going to set you up with your little, the piece you're going to talk about, independent physicians. So that's one where you arguably could say didn't meet the standard of care, right? You know, didn't inquire enough about the potential for bleeding, didn't have backup available, let the hand up do that. Who else, or what other tortfeasors could there be? How about, wait for the mic over here.
Yeah, we're going to say the same thing. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
The supervising, the attending physician.
The attending physician who asked for the line to be pulled out, who'd never pulled it out and should have known better, to ask somebody to pull the line out who'd only done it twice before. That person is insured by the hospital. Okay? That is a hospital-based physician versus the other independent physician. Absolutely right. And we all agreed when we did the event review, there should have been better supervision. You should have known. And again, for those who weren't here for the event review, the doc that pulled it out, it only pulled it out twice before, and it never pulled out a line that big.
And they did it on a unit where they weren't accustomed to doing that.
Yeah, so any liability that you see there where things didn't happen that otherwise would be reasonable, where would that lie?
Well, that would be, organizational policy around that.
So that's an organizational issue where you have sort of a hospital liability issue because they did not have anything in place to make sure that lines were pulled out in the right place. Absolutely. Who else? In this case, if you, again, for those of you who remember seeing that part, where perhaps one could argue that the care wasn't reasonable. In fact, I think many of the nurses in the room recognized that and pointed it out at the last time.
Oh, the nurse and the resident relationship?
Well, what did the nurse do? So here you're going to get the talk box. So talk a little bit more about the nurse who was involved in pulling the line out.
The nurse in the room had a relationship of friendship with the resident where she felt that, oh, he needs my help. Oh, it was a male nurse, and I believe, and this is my buddy, I'll help him out, I'll be in the room. I'm trying to remember.
Well, keep going, and then what else happened to the nurse when they pulled the line out?
The nurse did not have experience either.
So the nurse didn't have experience
Right.
with pulling the lines out. And remember, the nurse got paged and left the room and left the doctor alone.
Right.
So that was one of the other facts that's in there. And if you want to see this, they got, where's Kate? They got the case, right? So it's in your materials and stuff that's in there. Where
it's in that link
you can
that
really
was
look
sent out
through
with
and
your
you'll see this
resources.
piece. It's really important because this is going to set up the last enactment of the day is going to be in all the context of this. So you have, and remember what else was an organizational kind of standard of care issue?
Was it supplies or the?
No,
the
they didn't
stuff
have
on the
supplies
table?
organized,
There wasn't
may
a
not be
standardized
causation
kit.
there.
There wasn't a standardized kit.
It wasn't a standardized kit, but I might argue defense-wise, well, that's not, it didn't cause it. It would have been nice to have. What was one of the other issues that we identified where you could have huge organizational liability? And go ahead.
The communication from the department that was doing the procedures.
Yeah,
and
so the IR, the handoff process was completely broken. They didn't have that. And the other piece is, remember, there was not a standard protocol for pulling lines out, which the hospital owns.
Yeah.
This is, well, no, you have a lot of issues that
I
are
was going
here.
to say that they have organization. That's a lot of it.
And a lot of licensed practitioners involved. So you have the nurse who's involved here, you have the independent physician, and then you have the hospital employed physician. You have all that stuff that's there. So really begin to think about that when it relates to, wow, how do we go about and sort of resolve this? Remember, we didn't admit liability. Really, when we talked to the family, we just told them what happened and some of the mistakes were. And you saw they got asked to give the consent to consult their lawyer. So it's kind of setting the stage for what would happen after lunch. But do you want to move forward, Jen? Because I think it's going to be good to get into this conversation about the independent physicians.
Sure.
It's really, really important for this group.
Sure. So as I said earlier, MedStar, and I'm sorry, I probably can't give you the exact percentage, but the majority of our physicians are employed by MedStar, which does make this whole process a lot easier. It gets much more convoluted when you have providers with private insurers who are not on the Candor bandwagon. They don't recognize anything until it becomes a claim. They won't even open it, they won't look at it. So I would be lying if I said this was not a very big challenge for MedStar. We have moved so forward in the Candor process in terms of transparency that it is very frustrating when we come across an independent provider who even may want to participate in the Candor discussion but is held back by their insurer. You don't need to talk to this family. We'll defend you. Don't worry about it. It's not even a claim yet. There's nothing you need to do. So it is very difficult. And I don't know where, well, I should go back because I know that's hard to read, but I'm going to go on for a minute. So we have had some experience where we have had independent practitioners who actually do want to participate in the Candor process. And I'm just going to use your air embolism case that you just used. Let's say that the provider felt like that pulled it, thought when litigation comes in, or if litigation comes in, or if I had the opportunity to speak with the family, I really want to be able to do that. So oftentimes, we cannot get the independent practitioner to come in for these discussions with the family. And we will tell the family, not pointing fingers, not doing any of that, because that's not going to help anybody at the end of the day, that we are here on behalf of MedStar. The physician or provider that's involved is with a different organization, although works at MedStar, but we feel it's very important to talk to you and be as transparent as we can be with the care that we can discuss that occurred by our MedStar employees. Now, sometimes that works, but we can't speak on behalf of these independent providers. And so it is challenging because we probably can't answer some of the questions that this family has. We have had instances where, despite our conversation as an organization with these families, they're really focused on Dr. Jones. And for that reason, and maybe not only for that reason, but then litigation does ensue. So, It's very challenging. MedStar, we've tried to work with private insurers in our area to try and get them to appreciate what Candor can do for them in the long run with these patients and their families. We're moving slowly in that direction. I think there is more of a buy-in than there used to be, but it certainly could be a whole lot better. In fact, MedStar has joined with the doctor's company. I don't know if you all are familiar with it. It's a private insurer. And they work with us. We have some employed physicians that have coverage through TDC. And this often comes up in terms of when there is an event that involves their physician. We have a cooperative relationship with them. I will say that while it is a very positive relationship, they still are in the place of we're going to defend this care. So sometimes as the case progresses, we butt heads a little bit, but they are very respectful of where MedStar is, and most of the time we're able to reach a compromise on how to deal with those physicians. And if the physicians are employed by MedStar, TDC certainly supports MedStar in their transparency and conversations with these families.
You a question. Have you ever had a situation, or what would you do if the lawyer for the independent physician or the insurance company tried to forbid you from doing the Candor process? So not only will they not cooperate, but they say, you're going to throw our client under the bus, we know what's going to happen, you can't have that conversation. What would you respond there?
I will say I don't believe that has occurred, in all honesty. Any of these conversations, like I was just saying, the goal is not to throw anybody under the bus. I think we have to have a lot of planning in these conversations, especially when there's independent providers involved, so that we really are just going in there transparent for MedStar. And it would not be our practice to say, well, we did what we were supposed to do, but Dr. Jones, my gosh, he just yanked that line out. That's not going to happen. So it's a leap of faith, to be quite honest. I don't know.
So Jen, to follow up on what Marty said, to get a little more really down in the weeds, because I also want to talk to you all about what do you do when physicians won't lean in. A lot of policies are written saying that the patient's attending physician is the one responsible for disclosing unexpected outcomes.
Right.
And what Marty is kind of suggesting is, what if they veto that conversation? In other words, if they make this argument, it's a known complication, right, which means it wasn't necessarily unexpected. I talked about it during the informed consent. I am vetoing, per our policy, that I don't want that conversation to have, and per policy, I'm the one who's responsible for it. I think, Marty, that's where you're going. Yeah. I know MedStar is very different. Just want to know how you might handle that, and I'm also interested to other people here. Can you think of situations where physicians would say, not want to lean in and have that conversation? So
I know there have been times where physicians have not wanted to participate in this conversation. And again, I think all we can do is go in with what MedStar has and knows about the situation from our point of care. And that's really where we're limited at that point to really that scope.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a process where you would pick up the phone and call TDC and say, just want to let you know,
yes,
there was this event, your physician was involved, we're going to have a conversation and we would like to work together on this?
We have definitely done that. We have had conversations multiple times. I work closely with the claims persons for the doctor's company and for other private insurers, even where MedStar doesn't have a relationship with those persons. I have called their respective claim managers and said, this happened. MedStar feels strongly that this is something that we should get in front of and that we should deal with this family and try and answer their questions, and we are inviting you to be a part of that process.
Great. So that's why, handing it to my COPIC colleague here, how would you guys, work with this? You've heard what it is. You now insure this independent physician who pulled the line out. How would you all end up advising?
I would think that COPIC would be very receptive to having those kind of conversations with a MedStar type facility, as long as they're willing to go down that path, and knowing that we've been involved with some Candor cases here in Iowa as well, but we would be, if we were involved with the independent provider, that we'd be very open to entering in those conversations.
Others from other hospitals where you've encountered situations, not necessarily per a Candor conversation, but where you've run into barriers of physicians wanting to be part of open and honest communication? Over here, Marty?
Yep.
Yeah.
So honestly, I can't speak very clearly to that, but what's more common for us is that because we're such a small hospital and most of Iowa is populated with critical access hospitals, when we have a significant event, it's typical for us to transfer the patient out. And so coordination of that communication with the secondary or tertiary center becomes more concerning, I guess. We don't always know what they've been told, and so that communication piece becomes critical, and that's not an easy thing to work with, as we found, so.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Kate, we talked about that, and there is a potential solution to that piece of it, which is, getting that collaborative together of hospitals that are in the same geographic area so that when something happens, you can do that. One of the real exciting areas where we're doing this, not with the Candor legislation, but with just Candor per se, is in Phoenix, where we've had Dignity Health, Banner Health, and Honor Health. So we have 90% of the market have all gone through the kind of 4 workshop training you guys have, and they have created a collaborative of all 3 systems so that if a patient moves from one hospital to the other, they have a clear chain of communication. So again, they can build trust between the organizations so that they can be open and honest with that. And I've tossed that out to Kate down the road. It's not a hard model to begin to think about, and it seems like that y'all in Iowa, this might be, kind of one of the interesting new steps. And then you can begin to share lessons learned as you go forward doing that.
And I think we could potentially help facilitate some of that discussion. That may be a topic you bring to district quality meetings as you start to partner with some of your closer districts. I think that's a good topic to bring up.
Yeah. Kate, I think you definitely could do that, because this issue is happening in Minnesota too. There's a system that's embracing Candor there that is using their statewide coalition to say, okay, how do we do the situation that this woman mentioned, where part of the care happens in our hospital, then there's a transfer to another hospital, and we don't really know what happened there. We don't really know what the causation was. So it's got to have this sort of geographical coordination piece, I think, and you guys are well positioned to do that.
Yeah. So again, on the independent practitioner, I'm just going to toss this out to my Iowa colleagues, and I think I have this right, having had the conversations, is that when it comes to the independent or otherwise, and Kate, again, if I got this right, is that if the Candor conversation leads to a resolution, let's say the air embolism case, of all people who are involved, the nurse that's involved, the attending physician, the independent physician, the hospital, and all that, if I've got this right, then there will be no requirement to report to the National Practitioner Data Bank because it's followed the law. That's my read of the law too, Jen, because no formal claim has been filed by the patient or the family or their lawyer, then that doesn't trigger the National Data Bank reporting that's there. And also, if I read it correctly, there would be no requirement to report people to the state licensing board in Iowa as well. Okay. Jack and Teresa, how do you feel about that? I mean, Mike addressed it a little bit, but I mean, this is the spot today for us to have a little bit of conversation about how that, and Susan, I'd be interested from you as well as a mom who's got, kids with lots of health care issues. I'd be interested from both of you to talk a little bit about how you feel about that.
Go ahead. I need to think about it.
Well, what part of it specifically, Tim, you want me to?
Well, so as we talked about on the phone, one of the purposes of data banks and state licensing board is to serve sort of an oversight role to ensure that if you've got really bad licensed practitioners, whether they're nurses, nurse practitioners, docs, or what have you, that there's a mechanism in place to protect the public. And that having a system where nobody gets reported to those agencies may not be providing the best protection for the public. And that's what Mike mentioned is one of the biggest issues that comes up with him as he goes out and he tries to expand this kind of work.
And that was one of the things that Teresa mentioned this morning, and the first thing the two of us talked about when we read the Iowa bill is what mechanism is there for reporting a doctor who this is his fourth or fifth, case of not malpractice, but medical errors. Mm-hmm. And if he's never reported to the state board, then he just continues to move from perhaps from hospital to hospital. If they let him go at one hospital, and he moves on somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So you do need some oversight. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure how that oversight would work with and moving around. And I know there's cases of it.
Right. So this is where I put Jen on the hot spot, right? As you know. So MedStar has a ton of employed physicians, and as was mentioned, they're in a really great position to be able to settle these cases in the name of MedStar, and physicians don't get reported per se. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, but what MedStar's commitment is to ensure the safety of the public and the patients who come to your 10 hospitals and
Sure.
gazillions of clinics?
Sure. So again, I know this is a hot topic of conversation. So MedStar typically, and I'll use typically, does not report to the National Data Bank. However, having said that, we do report to the state of Maryland, to the Department of Health, any claim or settlement that we are involved in. So we do pass on that information. Now, we are primarily in DC and Maryland, for those of you that don't know our system. In DC, there is no jurisdictional requirement to report. So it's interesting because when we report to Maryland's Department of Health, to my knowledge, that does not automatically result in the Board of Physicians getting involved. Mm-hmm. But I will tell you that most of the time the Board of Nursing will be, we usually get something from the Board of Nursing if a nurse has been named in some kind of complaint. Mm-hmm. The piece that I think, that I want to stress is that MedStar certainly takes it seriously, and we do not want to have quote-unquote bad actors out there in the community or moving on to other hospitals and hospital systems. We do have a strong internal process to look at the performance of certain, for all our providers. And it does get hard. I mean, there are some specialties certainly that just by the nature of their specialties are going to draw more claims and lawsuits than other specialties are going to draw, just by the nature of their practice. We have internal processes in place to determine if disciplinary action should be taken against this provider, whether it's suspension, revoking privileges, a performance improvement plan. Mm-hmm. There are multiple things that we try to keep in place for our credentialing purposes, because as Tim alluded to the other day on the phone, if we're not cognizant of the performance of our providers, and we have a bad actor out there doing all kinds of things, most importantly, it's not safe for the community that we serve. And secondarily, we legally can be faced with multiple problems, including negligent credentialing, which can lead to punitive damages. But I say that as an aside because, again, the focus really here is what's the safety of our patients and our families. The other thing I would add, which I had explained on our phone call the other day, is that from my experience, and I've been doing this for a while, it's very rare that it's one provider that is responsible for a bad outcome. For all of you that are involved with event reviews, RCAs, whatever term you use, it's normally a sequence of events that lead up to the ultimate outcome. And many of those are system processes. So for that reason also, like Larry likes to say, it's a team sport in terms of liability. It is not just Dr. Jones out there on his or her own. Many times our processes that we have in place may not protect our providers the way that we had thought it would, and ultimately led to this outcome. So using the team sport analogy is another reason typically MedStar does not report. Now, in the rare instance that it is an egregious act and it is clearly falling on the shoulders of a provider, MedStar has reported to the National Data Bank.
Great, thank you. Susan.
Yeah. I wanted Jack to comment first because on the provider oversight issue, because my family has not been, fortunately, subject to medical harm or error. But what I do want to say is that we've worked with, amazing providers. So I have 3 adult children, 2 are special needs, who I've navigated the health system for about 20 years. So I think my comment is that for my family, the system of care is where the problems have been because the system has not been adaptable to special needs, intellectually disabled, people who don't understand, what they're going through when they're entering the healthcare system. And so we've had amazing providers, but the system has not been adaptable. So my comment would be that along the way, I've found that what's really important for an organization is their culture of being willing to work with families, caregivers, their openness to things that aren't working well for people, being willing to ask patients and families, what could we do better? What works really well here for you? What doesn't work so well for you? So what I hear in MedStar is that culture exists, and that's what I would encourage, all organizations to implement. We hone in on the providers in these scenarios, but I think the system has to have the culture in the first place of working with patients and families, and that will go a long way in all the other aspects.
Great, thank you. Marty?
Make a comment too.
Sure.
So one of the things that Tim mentioned about me is that I work with hospitals and hospital systems to develop patient and family engagement processes such as PFACs. And we've just had a project where we've got to go and look at high performers, hospitals that are really engaging patients and families in quality and safety work. And when this issue comes up, what I think the patients we've talked to want to know is there some process in the system or in the hospital where if there is a bad provider, even though it's really rare, there's some systemic response to that. And Jen, I think that's what you're getting at. You didn't say it as clearly as I'd prefer, but honestly, it's like, if you find a bad doctor, do you have a mechanism to deal with that, to take his credentials away, to get someone to know? That would just make me feel more comfortable. And the hospitals that have impressed me have been ones who said, you know what, we did find a guy who shouldn't have been doing surgery anymore or shouldn't have been doing this. And it was a high revenue generator, so it wasn't easy for us, but we have a mission, we have a vision, we have a culture that says we protect the public and we serve our people. And so we've got a response ready. Hopefully it'll never happen, but we've got a response ready.
Sure. It could be a guy or a gal. Marty.
Could be a guy or a gal. Thank you.
So we do. I'm pretty gender sensitive for lots of reasons, as Marty knows, and this is equal opportunity amongst no, seriously, every practitioner.
So we'll have to ask them their pronoun when.
That's right. Well, no, but Marty, you're right. In this case, just because of the way our actor availability turned out, it was all males that were involved in it. So you're not off base there, Jack.
You know, as a law enforcement officer, and things have changed a little bit since I retired, but there are multiple layers of systems to identify a bad cop. And bad cops are fired on a regular basis. Last year there were, I think, 15 cops that shot and killed an individual, unarmed individual. All 15 of them were prosecuted and or fired. In the medical system, as I mentioned earlier, you have 440,000 deaths due to medical errors. How many people in the public know that? How many people in the public know it's the third leading cause of death in the United States? And it's only heart disease as number one and cancer is number two, and the third leading cause. I was shocked beyond belief when I first heard that. And the number has grown. That's the number we need to turn around. And I'm not saying it's bad doctors. I'm just saying that the system needs to be check on itself. And MedStar Health is, I'm a little prejudiced, but I think it's one of the leaders in the country in this field of transparency, early resolution, patient safety, and quality of care. I think it's on the cutting edge of, and I know there's other states and other medical systems that have their system. I just personally think MedStar has the best, but it also is a very large system. It's over 30,000 employees and thousands of doctors. So they have some resources that perhaps smaller hospitals don't have. But even with that, they have the personnel in the right positions, Jen and her boss, Larry, and Dave, Mayor, Dr. Mayor, who push for the Candor program. And before the Candor program even existed, that name perhaps came after myself. They were kind of calling it the 7 pillars. But I'd just like to see all systems move a little closer to the MedStar health system.
Great. Thanks, Jack. I think that puts us in a good position to move to the next slide.
Do you want me to talk about this slide a little bit? Okay.
Yeah.
So
the hammer letter.
I was going to say, you all have been staring at it for a while, but this is a sample letter that a independent provider provided to his, and it was a he, private insurer in a case with MedStar. This was a case, to make a long story short, there was an aortic injury during the course of surgery. The patient ultimately did okay, but it did result in a lawsuit. There are multiple factors, as always. So not only was there the aortic injury with this surgeon in the OR, but there was questions of monitoring on the nursing part of MedStar. So we had some culpability with this patient's care. And our goal with this family was to resolve early. We recognized there were multiple opportunities. This was a case that didn't need to go to trial. that we felt that there had been a breach and that led to causation and to the injury. So the surgeon actually agreed that this was not a case that he wanted to have go to trial. His insurer was adamant throughout the discovery process that this was going to trial, that we could find someone, and for those of you that are involved in this aspect, there's always someone out there that can defend the care.
For the right amount of money.
For the right amount of money. Yeah. So we stressed to the counsel of our co-defendant that this was not a case MedStar wanted to take to trial, and that we didn't even see while we had some culpability in this case, we didn't even see it as a 50-50 split in terms of compensation for this family, and that this insurer needed to step up to the plate and help us in reaching a resolution, a fair resolution for this family. Ironically, and it is, life is funny, but plaintiff's counsel became aware that this co-defendant, not through us, he's friends with the neighbor of somebody, but found out that this independent provider did want to resolve this case. And so plaintiff's counsel, because they, of course, wanted to resolve it, I think they didn't, it would be easier to resolve, be faster to resolve than going through trial, the headaches of trial. So plaintiff's counsel started putting pressure on the private insurer in terms of a policy limit demand. And to make a long story short, we ultimately worked with counsel to come up with this letter, really through his attorney, but that this insurer needed to be on notice that if they go ahead and take this to trial, it needs to be out there that this provider wanted to settle and that he was requesting his insurer to have his policy limits available to resolve this case. Once this letter came out, interestingly, we ended up being able to work with this insurer. And at the end of the day, they did provide probably about 70% of the resolution for this case. Yep. But the surgeon involved was very frustrated with his insurer. He's like, I've been paying premiums to this company for years and years, and all I want them to do is make this case resolve. Yeah. And so I can move on.
Yeah, so that's called a hammer letter. It's actually pretty common in litigation when the docs are afraid, because remember, theoretically, without this, if it goes to trial and you get tagged for $3 million and you got a $1 million policy, your assets are at risk. So a lot of them will do this to get it out there. The most famous one I know, Marty, in Illinois, was a Rush case where an independent anesthesiologist had done a spinal anesthetic and in the process rendered a woman significantly impaired neurologically during that. And there were people in the OR who heard her keep complaining over and over and over how bad it hurt, and the anesthesiologist should have stopped. But the insurance company did not want to settle. So he did not do the hammer letter, but he was able, so it went to trial and it ended up being $11 million. And she only got $1 million in coverage. And he had to do a bad faith litigation against the insurance company. So these are one of the ways to get them to play ball when you go to do it. But suffice to say, it's complicated, when you have all these different the players that are in there. So thank you for that. Sure. So let's do the next slide before we head to lunch. One more after that. You go one more slide. Yeah, one more slide after that. So this slide we showed at the first workshop. And this is what Candor's all about. And I've added this in, so you may not see it in your handout. I'll kind of point to it over here. But this is really what patients and families want. Remember, they want, after harm events, not after mistakes per se, but when bad stuff happens, they want open and honest, effective, factual information. They want empathy, and they want not to be abandoned. And so it's triggered by harm. And so when we think about this, those are those adverse events, complications. In the case of Jack's case, a catastrophe. All of these things here are harm events, and those are the ones you need to think about having the conversation. The one where you now pull in this whole notion of inappropriate care is the part where you have the overlap, where you have medical errors or inappropriate care here. When those overlap with harm, these are the ones where it is inappropriate care that's caused the harm, that's brought it to the need to consider financial resolution. But most of the conversations, and this is actually drawn to scale, is most harm events involve appropriate care. The data out of Massachusetts is 85 to 90% of their candor conversations involved having that empathic conversation with the family, but explaining the fact that at the end of the day, the care was okay. Not perfect, but it was okay. The kind of case that falls into that, we're going to bring to the fore with our actors right after lunch is 3-year-old child, appropriate to get amoxicillin. The high dose they got did not cause the harm. The care afterwards was okay. It's one of those areas that's in the non-shaded area where you've made a determination care was appropriate, but these are some tough conversations. So it's just something to ponder over the next hour as we go to lunch, and when we come back, we'll do the setup again as some of you have seen before, and then we'll have that conversation. And then after we do that, Jen, we'll get into what are some of the financial and non-financial considerations for that. So any questions or comments before we head into lunch? I think our timing's okay, Kate.
We're perfect.
In fact,
Oh my gosh, 12:02.
wow.
Well done.
All right. All righty.
Okay.
So let's, why
Yeah.
don't you give instructions for lunch?
Sure. As we dismiss for lunch, please do exit through this set of doors. Go ahead and get your plate and then come back into the room using the far set of doors. That'll keep one single flow of traffic. We're coming back at 1 o'clock. If we all get back here about 10:10, we might start up early.
Yeah.
So we can get you back on the road. So thank you. Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you. Thank you.
I hope it's going.
Thank you.